To spend or not to spend? That's the big question. It's topical, and it starts right now. A very good evening to South Africans, those watching around the world. My name is Blaine Herman, and this is It's Topical, our digital audience tonight. Joining us from UNISA, UKZN, UW, NWU, and the University of Pretoria. They will weigh in terms of some of the burning questions they have for our guests, who are also among them. Good to have them on the program. It is often in difficult moments and tragedies that our humanity is revealed in its truth. Our soldiers give us the chance to appreciate this truth. They pledge to protect the territorial integrity of this country and its people, which allows us to go on with our business with the degree of confidence. Of late, we have lost. But the big question is, can we use tragedy to pivot to better, right? What have we learned from the deaths of our soldiers? Commander-in-Chiefs, President Cyril Ramaphosa, said at the transfer ceremony and memorial service for South Africa's troops killed in the DRC that they lost their lives in the name of duty, in pursuit of peace, and in the cause of silencing the guns across our beloved continent, Africa. It's a big ask, it's a big task. To what extent will this be factored in Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana's budget speech? The budget speech, as you know, among other things, aims to balance economic growth and support the vulnerable in our society, despite limited resources. So, is there room to maneuver? During the last financial year, the Peace and Security Cluster was allocated 765 billion rand to fight crime and corruption. 10,000 new police recruits were set to be trained. Was it that enough? Did it make a difference? What is your lived reality? Which brings us to the question of the week, and we ask you, should South Africa spend more on defense and policing? As always, simple question, complicated answers. Let us know at SABC News_TV. How will the math look come Wednesday? What are the fundamental factors that will form part of the calculus? Let us know your thoughts at SABC News_TV. Perspective coming up. So let's get your perspective on the matter. And our regular word on the street feature, we took to various streets seeking diverse insights and perspectives on this topic. And this is what people had to say. Take a look.
South Africa should not spend more on defense and policing. It's absolutely out of the question. There are more important things like the Department of Health and Education where we can spend more money there.
I think that it's very critical that we do add and give more funding towards our SANDF, not just towards their contribution to the war in DRC, but also locally here in terms of resource, in terms of capacity building, in terms of strengthening our actual defense force.
Some portion of the budget or money should be allocated in assisting such missions, because it's all about peace, isn't it? That's what we want for the whole continent.
There is no government in the world that does not take care of his army, and I am very, very sure that the budget allocated to South African military, it is the budget that the government believe it will do the job.
It's important to have a more budget on our police and defense, because those are our security, and we as citizens, we will feel free only if our defense force and policing are working well and they don't have problem of money.
Money might be very well spent in the country, where people are hungry and not getting enough food and no jobs and anything. I think it would be a better thing to, money could be spent better.
We appreciate your take on this matter. Let's get you some context. Walk with me. It's a difficult task, right, to balance the budget, especially with so many competing priorities, competing interests. How do you do that? How do you do that and still maintain fiscal discipline, reducing debt as well? I want to tee it up now, tee up the discussions, what we know and why it matters. SABC News economics researcher Vilemseni Mtiani joins me now live. Good to have your better mind on the program, sir, as always. Okay, let's talk first of all. So we're talking about the peace and security cluster, right?
Sure.
Start off with police as well. You see it gradually going up, but the big question, is it enough?
Well, Blaine, good evening to you and good evening to the viewers at home. So the issue of the security in South Africa has been the biggest problem. And part of it is because the budget has been cut, in particular for police as well as for defense. But in the graphics that we look at here, we see that there's some slight improvement in terms of the budget allocation for the police, because part of the reason that people have been complaining about is that the police to population ratio in South Africa is not according to international benchmark. Particularly as of 2023, South Africa was having one police was looking after 423 citizens. And that's a huge number in terms of the police to population ratio. But the budget have been cut in the past, say, for instance, maybe in the past 5 years. But now there's been a slight improvement in terms of increasing the budget so that there will be more visible policing in the community. Most of the times we hear that there is no van that could service a particular area. We hear that there is no police officer that could attend to the scene because there was a lack of recruitment, and now that's catching up with us. High levels of crime and people, they feel unsafe in the country. But the budget as it is, I don't think it's yet enough. But at the same time, we need to consider that the Minister of Finance is also having it hard for himself, because he has to take from A to fill from B and from B to C.
Yeah. Before we move on, what's the international benchmark? Do we know in terms of citizen to police ratio?
Well, I can't recall those figures very well, but currently we know that we are below what is internationally accepted benchmark in terms of police to population ratio.
You mentioned some of the issues. These are some of the challenges that are currently facing the South African Police Service in terms of infrastructure, in terms of insufficient resource, and obviously this is the big thing, right?
A very big thing, but it's not only the budget, Blaine, it's also the ability to manage the resources that are there. So when it comes to the institutions in South Africa, one of the things, even though the resources are limited, but we're also found wanting when it comes to governance. And the SAPs, they are not always innocent, also because some of the issues that we find there, for instance, the aging infrastructure, you would find that there are vehicles, but they're not serviced. So it's not a matter of not having the equipment or the assets to deal with crime, but they are not serviced. And if you can go deeper and realize that it's not also the issue of budget, it's the issue of poor governance and poor administration.
So the question is, it's not always about throwing more money at the problem. It could be an issue of using the money that you have more effectively. Now, the other focus is the South Africa's defense budget as well. Talk to us about this. It's been in the news of late. The debate has started. Given what we've seen in the DRC, should this be increased? What's your take?
Well, Blaine, firstly, we need to admit that South Africa, for the longest time, they've neglected the defense of the country when it comes to the budget allocation. International benchmark of funding the military is about 2.4% of the GDP. In South Africa, we are at 0.7% of GDP. But there is a hope, because we have heard that the president has considered, and together with his cabinet and the parliament, that the budget should be increased to about 1.4% of GDP. And that's going to give us something. If we look in terms of these figures, here, if we look, Blaine, it's about 52.4 billion rands that the subs have. So it means if we were to give them into the benchmark of the international level, this should be be going around about 120 billion. So they are short about 70, 75 billion. And that's the reason some of the equipment, military equipment, has not been serviced. The technology that is used there, particularly in the Gripen fighter jets and the Rifles, has not been updated. And some of other stuff, and it means the arms corps, the Denel, they're not able to continue to produce more weapons for the country, for the defense of the country. So if we look at the issue of the underfunding of the defense force has caused a lot of issue. But before I move on, I want to touch on the piece. Most people have been asking a question, what are we there for, particularly in DRC? So we know that South Africa is part of SADC. So in May 2023, there was a decision that was taken by the extraordinary summit of the heads of state and government that was held in Windhoek in Namibia, where they agreed that there will be a mission called Summit DRC, which was meant to be in line with the SADC Mutual Defense Pact of 2003. That said, if you touch one of us, you are destabilizing the region. Therefore, you will be met with the equal force. But has it happened? Only 3 countries currently are forming part of Summit DRC. It's Malawi, Tanzania, South Africa, and the bulk of the soldiers are coming from South Africa with that budget that is severely cut.
Contributing a country's, GDP or more bigger percentage of the country's GDP is an international conversation. You see what's happening in NATO now. You see what the ask from President Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump is. Give more. Countries give more towards NATO. But we'll see how that flows out. The cost of our deployments, what are we learning in terms of what is it costing this country to deploy our soldiers internationally? Well,
Blaine, if we were to go back and start where the democratic government of South Africa started to be involved in terms of the peacekeeping missions in this continent, the figures will go into probably hundreds of billions. But for the sake of today, if we look into Mozambique in 2024-2025, South Africa allocated at the very least the minimum, because these figures, I think they've been adjusted to about now 1 billion in terms of the Mozambique deployment. But we're looking at 850 million rands as a minimum. But when it comes to DRC, we're looking at about 2.4 billion. I'm sure when it gets adjusted, it goes way above that. So it's a lot of money that could be used in the country, but we must remember that we live not alone, but we live within the context of this African continent, and South Africa needs to be involved, Blaine. It's very important that even as citizens, we need to understand South Africa does not exist in a vacuum. It exists in a continent. If there are security threats, then South Africa needs to be part of that, because they're part of the AU and they're also part of SADC, as I quoted the SADC Mutual Defense Pact of 2003.
Thank you, sir. As always, pleasure.
Thank you,
we will take this conversation further in a short while. That was SABC News economics researcher Velimseni Mtiani. Let's do that right now. There's lots to discuss, right? Lots to unpack, various elements to this. And it's something that Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana will have to grapple with, whether to spend and what to spend on. I want to introduce my guests. We have Bongani Mahlangu, is from the South African Youth Council, NEC member, Policy Committee Chair, Political and Economic Governance Analyst. We also have Advocate Pikkie Greeff, National Secretary of the South African National Defence Union, John Stupart, Director of African Defence Review, as well as Thabang Bogopa, a researcher, police and crime is the beat. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me. Also, our digital audience as well. Please, if you have any questions, please raise your virtual hand. I'll do my very best to get you onto the program. If I can start with you, Bongani. The latest casualties, as we've been discussing in the DRC, is fueling this debate on whether the defense should get a bigger slice of the budget. We heard from Deputy Defense Minister Bantu Holomisa alluding to the possibility of a move from 0.57% to about 1.7% of the GDP. Is it practical? Do you see this happening?
Greetings, and also greetings to the viewers and fellow panelists and guests. It will happen, definitely. What can be argued is the scale of which it will happen, meaning the upward adjustment, what percentage of it. If you consider the midterm budget policy statement of October last year, which was the budget adjustment, there was an upward adjustment in the military budget. So if then further adjustments were to take place in the budget speech of this year, it would be consistent with that. And it's also equal to note that the downward adjustment in military spend does not start now, does not start with the fiscal consolidation of the sixth administration, but it actually started from 1994. Because if you look at 1994, we were at 2.5, 2.6% in terms of expenditure to GDP on military. And then in 2012, it was about 1%, and now we are sitting at the 0.7 that was provided to us earlier. So it has been a long time coming, and it's not consistent with South Africa's foreign policy, which summarized lately is build a better Africa and a better world. Because in order for South Africa to be able to do that, it has to project power on the continent. And you can't project power with a diminishing budget. And also, just to round it off, South Africa is a regional power in Africa. And it is a regional power because of the 4 power indicators, which is your population, your economic capability, military strength, and political stability. That is why South Africa is then required to take part in all these missions around Africa, also because we are a refugee-taking country. So we have that responsibility, but that responsibility requires resources. So it is now important, if we want to play in the geopolitical space, that our budget also aligns with our foreign policy.
Advocate Greeff, help me break down these numbers. This increase, this projected increase that we're talking about, what will it mean in practical terms for the men and women on the ground?
Good evening. Thanks for welcoming me on the program. I think firstly we must realize in what deep trouble the Defence Force actually finds itself. We are not even talking about upgrading military equipment and properly supporting our troops. We are talking about troops that are literally without boots. They have to buy their own boots, they had to buy their own tents to go to the DRC, etc., and the list is endless. So the most practical things is not being taken care of in this Defence Force, exactly because of the budget allocations. So if there's a budget increase, we would need it to be very consistent, and it would have to be predictable, and it would have to be over a definite period that's defined. In other words, we would have to know that this money is certainly coming in. But I think, having said that, what is very, very important then is planning. It's not enough to just simply throw money at a problem. One needs proper allocation, sensible allocation, and planning is needed. Where do you want to spend this money on? What do you want the Defence Force to do? What do you want it to be able to do? And then plan accordingly as far as finance is concerned. But yes, it will certainly help the Defence Force, provided that the money is sensibly applied.
John, agree, disagree?
Agree, 100%. I think look, any increase is always a positive sign. The fact that there's even a reaction to this is an encouraging sign. However, you don't just build a Defence Force overnight in one budgetary cycle. We're talking about a 10 to 15 year rebuilding process. So Advocate Greeff is completely right. This needs to be predictable, and it needs to be plannable over the long term. The funding levels required, you're looking at about a 2% of GDP would be perfect. That's going to need to be sustained over the long term, to the extent where many of the senior officers and senior planners and even some of the politicians who are involved in this process will not even live to see the fruits of its labor. And that's something the government has never really paid attention to here, is the fact that our Defence Force, and any Defence Force in the world, is built over decades, not in the short term. So we can funnel in money here right now in the short, but if there isn't policy and there isn't planning and there isn't an overhaul of our procurement system to actually spend and use this budget wisely over the next 10 to 15 years, it's just going to be wasted. I think another thing to consider is, our equipment levels are so utterly dilapidated that I think nobody's even necessarily ready to face the conversation that most of the equipment that we procured from the arms deal in the 90s and early 2000s are now reaching their end of lifespan and need replacement. And that's something to also consider in this new budgetary level. So there's a lot to plan for here.
Right. Advocate, where do you see the money going? Where's the most needed in terms of the Defence Force?
I think the most needed is, like I started off with, the most basic things. You know, if you don't get the basic things right, you can forget about the rest. That's number one. And the second thing is, I think definitely what is needed in the Defence Force is a mindset change as well, especially at the top, as to how we plan. And I think John has explained that quite well, because this is long-term planning. But in the first place, the most basic things. In the second place, the maintenance of what we can maintain to a certain extent. And then thirdly, we should be looking at long-term planning in terms of what do we acquire in terms of weapon systems and those kinds of things. Very important. We cannot overstress it enough. There's no short-term solution here.
Right. Thabang, the Peace and Security Cluster was allocated 765 billion rand in the 2024 budget to fight crime and corruption. From your assessment, from your research, did it make a difference?
Thank you so much for inviting me, and allow me to dig it a bit to say, regardless of the amount of budget that we allocate, I think the three panelists have already alluded that even if we over-allocate more money, however, the internal management processes, particularly of SAPS, are not par, then the allocation will not achieve what is intended or supposed to achieve. For example, in the South African Police Services, 80% of the annual budget allocation goes to paying salaries. Now you are only left with 20% to run the organization. But then the other challenge is that we have so many office-based senior officials in the SAPS, meaning that even if you increase the budget, you are actually increasing the budget for people who are mostly sitting in offices and having very little to do with the day-to-day policing aspect of the SAPS.
Well, help me understand that then, because you keep on hearing complaints from the general public about police visibility. How then do you balance that with bringing in more recruits, which obviously increases the budget for salaries, while maintaining the effectiveness of the budget within the organization in totality?
Thank you for that brilliant question. Firstly, recruiting new police officials would not necessarily solve the problem as much, because it takes a long period to have a new recruit become a very well experienced and reliable police official who can execute the mandate unsupervised. Now, what was attempted, I think, during General Ria Pierre's tenure was that most officials were then now reallocated to the provinces and the district levels to go and police the real crime that we see in the country. And in that restructuring, however, there were challenges, because there's a lot of police officials who are above 50 who can no longer go on the streets and do the actual policing aspect of police service. Now, that on itself is a problem. And perhaps a common recommendation that we hear from most experts is that SAPS should find a way of letting go of some of the older police officials, especially the higher ranking ones, who can no longer perform the basic functions of policing. But then also remuneration of the mid-ranking officials. In my closing, you have a lot of warrant officers. Let me give an example at the Forensic Science Laboratory or Forensic Division, which are people, including detective services, who must investigate a case within 24 hours of commission, who do not have basic overtime. So it means this person goes to work 7, 4 o'clock, they knock off. If a murder occurs after 5, no one is there to do the preliminary investigation until tomorrow at 7:30. And then lastly, if you go to Gauteng, for example, because the headquarters is there, you have a lot of cars that are parked after hours, driven by senior officials. But these senior officials are only doing office work. Now, if so much resources are allocated to, I would say, the nice part of policing, but it does not go into actually assisting the common citizen of this country.
Right. Point taken. Before I go to my digital audience, Bongani, look, domestic issues notwithstanding, the finance minister also has to grapple with how do you align the budget to South Africa's foreign policy. How does he grapple with that? How does he navigate through that?
All right, no, thanks. I think also I wanted to touch on this one of planning, but I'll start with that. is to understand that the foreign policy or deployment also align with South African domestic economic interests. For instance, when South Africa says build a better Africa and a better world, it speaks about silencing the guns in Africa. It speaks about advancing the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, which, if applied and applied properly, would have enormous economic spin-offs for our country that would see our revenues go up. Also, when it comes to the immigration issue, or the illegal immigration issue rather, it puts pressure on our fiscus. So that also then becomes an economic and social issue. So I'm just giving 2 or 3 examples that these things left neglected, they do put pressure on our domestic budget. So you need to deal with them there, meaning outside of South Africa, disincentivize an individual from walking all the way to South Africa. How do you do that? By ensuring that there is stability, there is prosperity where that individual is. That individual can drive wherever they are, then they do not become a fiscal burden to South Africa or our domestic needs or interests. When it comes to planning, I wanted to say that the Department of Defense has 8 programs. Those 8 programs would be led either by, I think, a DDG or a chief director. Those 8 programs would contribute to the strategic plan of the department. They would then also translate to the annual plans of the department. But if you look into those 8 programs, they've been underperforming. Underperforming, why? Because most of the targets there are directly or positively correlated with a budget. For instance, the number of hours that a ship has to sail and guard our coast requires money. The number of hours that a plane has to fly and guard the airways requires money. So without that money, that program cannot then perform. So then it means that it is not necessarily an issue of a plan existing or not existing being significant or insignificant, but rather the resources required to ensure that what we have planned actually materializes and we reach our performance targets from those 8 programs. And currently that is not the case. So I'm just raising that so we qualify as to what do we exactly mean by planning, and also in terms of planning for performance, and also planning in terms of the finance part of it, the financial planning. Thanks.
John, help us understand the targeted hours for the Air Force and the Navy that they need to spend in the ANC respectively.
I'll be honest, I don't really know the specifics, but I know that we're well short of what's required for those pilots to reach them. I think a lot of the flying, particularly in the combat airframes, our Gripen, our Hawk trainers and things like that, our pilots are desperately short of current hours to actually achieve anything like an operational sort of readiness. It was mentioned by a colleague earlier this week that our Gripen pilots, for example, or even some of our attack helicopter pilots lack the combat air hours and combat training that they have to go through to be prepared for their deployments. And it's been that way, frankly, for a long time. We've had moments where we've been able to put a couple of birds in the sky from a purely operationally ready point of view, but it's been few and far between in recent years. And I think frankly, it's never been worse this year. I think we've seen the sharp end of that simply by looking in the DRC, where our SAMI DRC forces had 0 air support, and there was 0 plan to put air support there because there was 0 capability to put air support in the Eastern DRC where it was needed, when it was needed.
Advocate, how big of a chunk is maintenance, especially for aircraft, for ships, vessels, of the South African National Defence Force budget?
Oh, it's absolutely, it should be a big chunk, let me put it this way, but it's not. And, most of the expenses goes to personnel, which of course is by no fault of the personnel, because the more you shrink the budget, but you pay the same amount of people, obviously that percentage will increase. But the vast majority of a defense budget should be going into maintenance and acquisitions and that kind of thing. And it's not, it's come to a point exactly as described by the previous speaker.
All right, we need to take a quick break. The question we're asking you is, coming up on the budget speech on Wednesday, 19th of February, where do you see the spending going? Is there going to be a reallocation of spend? Should the spend for policing, and defense be increased? Let us know your thoughts. When we come back, digital audience will get their bite. Welcome back. You're watching It's Topical. Budget coming up on the 19th of February this week. What's in store for South Africans? What's in store for the various priorities that South Africa needs to hit? It's important to understand what the finance minister is going to deal with. Balancing the budget, not an easy task, right? The finance minister needs to deliver a prudent budget. How? Is there any room to maneuver with regards to spending on defense and spending on police? It's been a lot of talk, a lot of debate, fueled by the situation in the DRC as well. So, will we get that increase, and what will that increase be used for? Also, the question becomes, is it just about throwing money at the problem, or is it about using the current budget effectively? Let's go to our digital audience, get their take on this matter. I want to speak to Ms. A.M. Kapato. Your thoughts, your questions for our guests.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'd just like to reiterate Bongani's point that our foreign policy needs are not divorced from our domestic needs. So it's definitely in our interests to increase the budget, and the 1.4 increase is a step in the right direction. But perhaps what we're not discussing is whether the government purse has increased to accommodate this 1.4% increase, because if it hasn't, then we risk cutting from other departments, and South Africa does not have the economic standing to cut from other departments.
All right, let's hear from LJ, then Colin.
Thank you very much for having me on. My question to our ex-panelists is, with regards to the SANDF, is there not a need to almost fundamentally alternate how it functions, because it's not simply operating in a peacekeeping capacity anymore? The needs of the SANDF, whether it be the previous mission in Mozambique, internal security during COVID times, or when there was the arrest warrant for former President Jacob Zuma, the current events in the Congo fighting M23 rebels, that goes beyond its peacekeeping mandate. And with the lacking funding for all those three branches, isn't there, beyond just funding, isn't there a fundamental need to reassess what the mission of the SANDF is, and to perhaps improve its warfighting capacity? And how can we do that, not simply with funding, but organizationally, when the burdens of the organization have increased so much?
All right, LJ, thank you very much. Before we get to Colin, maybe let me get John and Pikkie to come in there with regards to John's question about re-looking at how the SANDF operates and their function.
I think first and foremost, our SANDF forces are not there on a peacekeeping mission. I know it's been said time and time again by many senior government officials that our forces are peacekeepers there. That is simply not the case. It's untrue. They're on it's called a peace enforcement mission, and the difference is one from a very passive, quite a sort of defensive stance, operationally, strategically, tactically, in terms of their rules of engagement and so on, and the equipment that you supply, and peace enforcement, which is a far more aggressive, go out and get them kind of mission. However, that being said, your point is absolutely the right question to ask here above all else. We can increase our budget to 1.4, to 1.7. We can increase it to 5% every year of GDP for the next 30 years. But if we don't think about how this fits into our national security interests and in terms of our foreign policy, it's pointless. We'll just simply be buying equipment for the sake of buying equipment. And I think before we even think about whether we should keep Gripen and whether we should get rid of tanks, or maybe we should be buying more ships and things like that, we should be thinking, well, what is our foreign policy? What is it we want to achieve? Do we still want to get involved in African affairs? Because then that means we need to have a military that can back up the words and promises we make. We need to be able to, as was said earlier, project power. If our foreign policy is different, then that needs to match the defense, or the defense force rather needs to match that posture. And I think that's a very important discussion that actually supersedes the defense force, and that needs to happen first, before we start looking at what we're going to buy.
Belligerency advocate, the condition of being, in fact, engaged in war on one hand, and peacekeeping. Government maintaining that there's a strong element of peacekeeping on the continent. Give us the practical difference on the ground so the viewers can understand.
Peacekeeping is basically looking after the local population, if I could put it in quite simple terms, and seeing to it that no harm comes to them by other belligerent groups and protecting them. So it's a very a stance where you're actually very static, let me put it that way, to a certain extent. Peace enforcement is something completely different. That means you are actively seeking out the belligerent groupings that are perceived to be the enemy, and you are trying to eliminate them. It's quite simply going after them aggressively. And that's exactly what South Africa has been doing in the DRC for the past year with this deployment.
Colin, let's hear from you, your take.
Thank you very much, Blake. I think this topic is very necessary in the contemporary dynamics in South Africa. I mean, it is very much of a need for the budget to increase, especially for the South African National Defence Force and South African Police Service, because when we look at the functions of both of these state security clusters, they are very overstretched. When you look at the role of the police, especially in terms of policing illegal minings, they fell short, which exacerbated the need for the recruitment of South African National Defence Force. I mean, when you look at our border patrols, the police can't do it on their own. They also need support of South African National Defence Force. So to recapacitate both institutions with financial support will enable each institution to perform their duties as expected. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin. Dimakatso, let's hear from you. Then Kolo. Dimakatso, first to you.
Yes, greetings, everyone. My primary question is that there has been many reviews of our security clusters over the years, but we've done nothing about it, and what we continue to do is overexert our security cluster. Where exactly is the primary problem? Because we speak about budget, we speak about increasing it, and we also still saying that it's not necessarily the solution. So where is the targeted problem, and how do we fix it in the immediate? Because there are currently soldiers in the DRC now that need the current necessary resources to continue exerting their functions. So we can't go on ignoring that there's a dire necessary need in the immediate to solve the issues. So we need to pinpoint exactly where the problem is coming from, and how long is it going to take us to fix that problem, even domestically. And we can't divorce the idea of the domestic framework and the foreign policy framework. We need to find a marriage between them and create a stabilized environment. So it's very necessary to understand where the problem is, and that's what I want to find out, is where is the problem.
Thabang, what do you have to say in terms of your research and pinpointing the problems?
Thank you so much. And a brief answer to Dimakatso, the skills deficiency in our security cluster. And it's a very sensitive topic to even mention, but we need a real skills audit focusing on the decision makers in our security cluster, particularly the defense generals and the SAPS. Another issue would be duplication of the intelligence services. We have the National Intelligence Agency, we have intelligence in the military, we have intelligence in the SAPS. 3 intelligence legs for one country, but we still find ourselves having the same problems. And imagine if there could be one standardized intelligence which is really capacitated and in line with the challenges of the day, the challenges of 2025. Also, the inclusion of the relevant technologies, because there's a lot of challenges in military, law enforcement, and also policing sciences that could easily be solved or resolved using technology. I do not want to give example of the Russia and Ukraine issues, but you could realize that certain issues can be managed through the use of technology if you have the right capacitated leaders in this organization. And lastly, the issue of political influence, particularly which affect the deployment of senior leaders of these institutions, we need to be open about it. It comes at a point whereby certain strategic leader or a strategic head of a department cannot make certain decisions, and we just have to fold our arms and pray at sometimes that nothing goes wrong. Unfortunately, when things goes wrong, we now have to look around and shy away from the real problem that we need proper skills audit of the decision makers of the law enforcement agencies, security cluster, particularly the military and the SAPS in our country.
Tolo, let's hear from you. Your question, comment?
Thank you, Blaine, and thank you to the panelists. Look, I think, whilst strengthening our defense may highlight our commitment to peace and stability in the heart of Africa, we cannot do so, or obviously not to the disadvantage of South Africans who expect lasting solutions to other pertinent issues, which the executive has, in fact, failed to resolve in recent years. So our provision of aid, I think, in the war-torn eastern region of the DRC, with the resultant budget speech on Wednesday, albeit to our own peril and tragedy, as we have seen in recent weeks, must not be perceived to trump all other rights that are vested in the Bill of Rights, which South Africans should enjoy. So granted, South Africa should spend on defense, but objectively not more than is reasonably necessary. And if we're going to look at the tragic loss of the 14 lives, many South Africans are of the view that sending soldiers to foreign conflict under the premise of peacekeeping or peace enforcing against M23 rebels, but then ill-equipping them adequately, then would constitute a grave miscarriage of justice and would be really opprobrious on the part of the government. So it is a tragedy that we must account for, but South Africa, like any other country, must balance its national security interests with the safety of its personnel. So the loss has obviously eroded public support for the mission and has led to heightened pressure on the government to reconsider its engagement by the public. So I think the question is then, how do we balance the national security interests with the safety of the personnel whilst actually enforcing peace in the DRC?
No, it's a comment well noted, and I guess the operative word, Bongani, is balance. Every department wants more money. Where's the money going to come from? Funding the projected gap between revenue and spending. Is the minister likely to increase taxes in this regard?
No, thanks. I think I like also I'll link it to what LJ spoke about. When we speak about operational efficiencies, effectiveness, and stuff like that, administrative stability, and so forth. So if you look at our budget currently, or revenue rather generated, there is a leakage. So if you want to balance all the domestic interests and even foreign interests for that matter with limited resources, you have to then start closing the leakages. One leakage I can make citation of: if there is illegal mining, for example, illegal mining is a leakage of more than 20 billion rands per annum. Maybe just from gold alone, as that resource or that mineral alone. There are other leakages as well. So what you need to do is to close the gap. Illicit capital outflows. We are speaking about 150 billion rand on average per annum. That is leaked out of the South African economy. So you can go item by item and expenditure item, vote by vote, and close the leakages. And that leakages can then allow for resource mobilization internally. So that is revenue enhancement, basically. Right. So you don't even need to go outside of our government to look for that. But that has not been done, because even if you look at the fiscal consolidation that is currently in place, it has not went to an extent of which it closes the leakages. Rather, it has only cut expenditure, and by cutting expenditure, it has also minimized the ability of the state to adhere to the same constitutional prerogatives that it must champion, and resources are required for that. So you just need to be creative in how you play around with numbers. But also, on the last point, 60% of our budget goes to social spend. Right. If you look at the multiplier effect of social spend is low. The government has been trying, I think, for the past two years or so, to increase expenditure in terms of fixed gross capital formation, because we know the multiplier there is high. So that means you stand to generate revenue there. You stand to also create employment there. And by creating employment, you're you increase your tax base and you generate more revenue. So that means they must also look at how do we do that so we can increase revenue, so then that we can then fund these other priorities. The medium-term the medium-term development plan, priority number 3 of the state for the next 5 years, speaks about building a capable state. There is no way you can build a capable state if you have a weak military, if you have a weak police force, and so forth, a weak security cluster. So that means then if you have identified it as a priority area for the next 5 years, then funding must back it up. So if government were to implement priority number 1 of inclusive economic growth and so forth and so on, it would generate the necessary resources in order to put in the other priorities of the state.
It talks about the predictability, I guess, John, that you had alluded to earlier on. Someone once told me that having a defense force is like having an insurance policy you hope you never require, right? But if you do require it, they need to be combat ready. How far away are we from 100% being combat ready? What would that budget, that increase, projected increase, needs to go to first?
So I think assuming we continue with the military that we have and that we want to have, where we are now from where we need to be is there's quite a large gap. But fortunately, some of the things can be sort of filled in quite quickly. Our maintenance and operation ability, for example, of our fighter jets and our Gripen fighter jets could be brought up to speed with a little bit of elbow grease, but also with just a lot of sort of agile thinking with regards to our service providers and things like that. I think we could get that up to speed pretty quickly. The same with our Rofel attack helicopters. I mentioned these two because these two would be instrumental in the kind of expeditionary warfare that we're currently engaged in the DRC and previously in Mozambique and elsewhere in other areas. You know, I think those two would be very, very efficient. Things like providing operation ability in terms of fuel, funding, training, and overhaul and repair of our naval vessels, our frigates in the Southern African coastal region. We have a lot of ocean and part of our territory in our exclusive economic zone that needs patrolling, and we're simply not doing it right now. I think that could be brought up pretty quickly with a bit of funding. I think those things are quite not easily done. I think nothing's easy in this regard, but certainly doable. For the rest, however, you know, we're talking huge training cycles. Intakes of soldiers need to be brought up. We need to train new soldiers to replace the aging infantry and other services that we have at the moment. And I think that's, you know, those things take time. And I think that no amount of money can speed that up too much, but it definitely wouldn't be a bad place to start. Yeah.
I guess it talks to, Advocate, future and sustainability. Is the SANDF attractive to the youth? Is the SANDF recruiting enough young people in terms of sustaining these missions?
No, I think it's become clear that they're not recruiting enough new recruits every year. One of the main reasons is, of course, back to the question of the budget. I think young people do see it as a excellent career choice. It's not a bad paycheck for a young person to be getting, especially someone who's just left school. It's a good career path, provided that the military operates at its highest capacity. You can really build a good life in the military, you know, and I'm afraid there's just simply not the resources to be doing that. And I think the other thing that's also very important is the issue of training was mentioned. It's not only new recruits who need training, right? It's those people who serve every day. They need to be trained. While they're not in combat, they should be training and retraining. And if they can do it 100%, they should be doing it 110%. And that capabilities is simply not there. People don't get that opportunity to be that much retrained and so on. And if you put that together with being ill-equipped and supported, then that just absolutely spells disaster.
Right. Thabang, in terms of policing, the skill sets, I guess, can translate across, right? The high level of skills you need in terms of combating organized crime, for instance. For that, I assume you need a lot of special projects. There's a spectrum of instruments that you need in order to combat organized crime, which costs a lot of money. How do we tackle that problem? Thabang?
Thank you so much. And it is very sad that Dr. General Levier is now, his term is ending. And I'm saying this because he's been fighting to capacitate the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigation of the SAPS, which is the Hawks. And we are saying that the SAPS should benchmark against international organizations like the FBI, the CIA, in terms of what training is required. But luckily, in terms of policing, security science, and military intelligence in South Africa, we have institutions of higher learning which are offering those qualifications even up to doctoral degrees. And the law enforcement and security cluster should actually partner with institutions of higher learning to ensure that the decision makers in our security cluster are equipped at the right level.
Thabang, thank you very much indeed. I want to thank my guests as well, Bongani, Advocate Pikkie Greeff. John, thank you so much. Thabang and the digital audience, no doubt we'll see what's in store, how the math turns around, what sort of factors will form part of Minister Godongwana's calculus. Thank you so much for enlightening our viewers. Appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed. All right, before we go, here's my take. And regarding the Defence Force spend, and look, I don't know the exact solution. I don't have line of sight in terms of the exact challenges faced by this country's Defence Force. Many of us don't. So as citizens, what do? We offer different opinions based on personal perspectives and personal desires to see the situation turned around the very best way it can. The one part of it is, well, I guess we have a right to do that, right? It's perks of living in a constitutional democracy. But what we can agree on is the ideal, the most suitable, giving our soldiers the resources they need to fight the good fight, to protect this country's territorial integrity in one way or another. The same applies to the police service. It's important. Why? Ultimately, their action safeguards you and your family. I don't envy the Minister of Finance at this time the great need to present a prudent budget. He has a difficult task, balancing many competing priorities. We shall see how he squares this circle come Wednesday. And that's my take. If you miss anything on this program, then be sure to watch this episode of It's Topical on YouTube and look it on your screen, SABC Plus. On SABC Plus, you will also find a range of our previous shows, including the Expropriation Act, the State of the Nation Address, the SA-US Executive Order. Still very much topical, no doubt. Interesting viewing. Trends Live, Trends Travel up next. If you're watching a repeat of this program, then as always, the news continues. Until next week, my brothers and sisters, take care. Bye-bye.